Welcome back, everyone, to the second part in a series on fortified and aromatized wines. We said vermouth just to get more of you to join us, but we're not actually talking about vermouth today. These are, technically speaking, not vermouths because they're not using wormwood. Is that it? Is that all that makes them not vermouth, Jake?
Well, they're not using wort. They're still wine. They're still at least 75% composed of grapes, but they are not bittered primarily with wormwood. Americano does require a little bit of wormwood in there because of a historical association. But no, we're going to talk about other bitter botanicals here.
Cool. All right. So we wanted to focus today on, we mentioned it briefly last week, cinchona, quinine, and gentian. So where do we start if we're going to talk and taste through both of these things?
Sure. Welcome. I think a really important place to start is where we started last week, which is these are wines. Put them in the fridge after you open them. Please, please, please. Your grandfather's bottle of Dubonnet that sat above the fridge for 12 years was bad 11 years and 3 weeks ago. Please, you want all, it's so important. We're going to talk so much about grapes tonight because the grapes are such an important part of why these things came to be, what they bring to cocktails, and why you keep going back for sip after sip. And so put them in the fridge after you open them and use them within a few weeks. Please, 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 please. All right, last week we talked about vermouth. We talked about wormwood. There's a nice wormwood sprig. It is wormwood is endemic to Europe. It is intensely herbaceous. We like to think that it sort of numbs the tip of your tongue, which is stuff we'll talk about maybe next week. But today we're going to talk about wines bittered with other botanicals. Gentian, probably, we call it king of the bitters because it shows up so much in spirit-based bitter things as well as wine-based bitter things. Both the flowers and the roots of gentian, which is also endemic in Europe, provide an earthy and vegetal bitterness, kind of some people liken it to the inside of a head of lettuce. Some people liken it to something a little more earthy. I always find a little bit of white pepper in gentian as well, and it kind of burrows into the middle of your tongue. And then the upstart, a botanical that's not endemic to Europe, cinchona. Cinchona is a tree. We're referring to its bark. That's a beautiful bark pick there. If anybody's got a better bark pick, I'd gladly take it off your hands. But we're going to go with that for bark for now. And cinchona is the source of quinine, a relatively simple organic molecule that was extremely celebrated in the late 19th century for reasons both very serious and very frivolous. It has a taste of a very dry spice and very much all the way at the back of your mouth, at the back of your tongue. So where you learn in second grade that you taste bitterness, which is of course not true, that sort of classic kind of thing that makes the back of your tongue cinch up. So much like we did last week, we're going to go through kind of the reasons for being of this stuff. Going to do it relatively quickly. We'll take Americano and Quinquina side by side. Americano is wine primarily bittered with gentian, but there is a vestigial requirement for wormwood. One of the sources of the term Americano in Italian is the idea that it was a reflection of an American tradition of adding bitters to vermouth. Now, the only place I've ever been offered a bottle of bitters with a glass of vermouth is in Spain, but hey, Italians, they like to claim everything. Another one of those myths, though, is the idea that Americano is a little bitter, a play on the word Americante, the word for bitterness. The idea of the diluted espresso drink having the same name as a bottled wine bittered with gentian and a little bit of wormwood is not entirely strange for both of those explanations. Quinquina, or an Italian Quinato, wine bittered with quinine, extracted from cinchona bark. Quinquina is the French word, Quinato is the Italian word. While the formulations of them can be relatively similar, the the drinking traditions associated with them are a little bit different. We're going to focus primarily on Quinquina today because that's the one that has a lot more play in the cocktail world. So, but again, these are wine, these are wine, these are wine. So there's a beautiful picture of a vineyard where the Barolo for Coquis Barolo Quinato comes from. So what is gentian? I mean, cinchona, you can only go so far on cinchona, right? It's a bark. Gentian is one of the very few botanicals used in alcoholic beverages. Oh, good. Dan's coming on right at the right time.
That almost looks like a. That also almost looks like a.
Go ahead.
That almost looks like a picture of him pulling.
It does sort of look like if Dan Farber were from the Auvergne, he would look like that.
Here, let's get him on.
There's Dan. There's Dan, who needs to lower his screen so we can see his beautiful still.
There you go.
There we go. Are you cooking today, Dan?
No, but I should be. I'm freezing today. I'm moving wine starting tomorrow. Oh, look at that.
See. Look at that beautiful.
Is that you? Is that you digging that gentian root out, Dan?
No, I have a funny story about gentian. I've
Only
never
one?
seen it. Yeah, I've never seen it grow like this. I was in the Chartreuse. I was working in the Chartreuse, and I wanted to. This is maybe worth 2 seconds. And I wanted to bring back some gentian to grow here. So I drove up, to these areas where I know that the gentian grows. And I harvested some rhizomes, beautiful yellow flowers, harvested these gorgeous rhizomes and brought them back to my hotel. And I thought to myself, yeah, I know gentian, but did I really look at it and see if I identified this in kind of detail? Well, sure enough, there's a lookalike of gentian that grows in the same area, which is poisonous. And I had picked the dang lookalike. So I was like, but I really wanted some gentian. So I drove back up 45 minutes up the mountain the next day, went, and clearly you can tell the difference if you're looking for it, harvested the gentian roots, proceeded to plant gentian roots and try to establish, some colonies.
Kids, don't do this at home.
What?
Don't import foreign plant material into America,
didn't say
especially into California.
I didn't say I was in France. I didn't say anything. But as it turns out, and this is the interesting part of this, it does not grow. It does not propagate asexually. It's one of the only plants I know that has a root like that grows from a rhizome, and it itself will produce further plants, but you can't propagate it from the roots. It has to be propagated from seed. So it's a very odd plant in that regard.
Well, and once it flowers, it dies, right?
Once it flowers, it dies.
So gentian is one of the very few botanicals in the drinks world that takes longer than one growing season. Tree barks notwithstanding. So much like agave, when it flowers, it dies, and it takes a long time to grow. So luckily it grows in a lot of places in Europe, and so it's been known since essentially prehistoric times as a thing with effects that we can't talk about because we can't talk about medicinal effects of alcohol. Mm-hmm. Both the flowers and the roots are used for bitterness. The flower is referred to in Italian as gentianella, which I love, and then the roots are sort of what you think of, and they look a little bit horseradishy. This is yellow gentian lutea. There's also a blue one out there, but gentian, of the three main bitters, gentian is the one you come across the most because it's the bitter in Angostura bitters. It's the bitter in virtually all Italian Amari. It's the bitter in Moxie. I know there's some Moxie fans out there. This is the core, the king of the bitters, as we like to say. What is quinine? Well, no more bark picks, I promise. Quinine is not endemic to Europe, and so when its effects were discovered, and of course anti-malaria being the most important, that's the picture on the right. When its effects were discovered, it began to be popularized at just the same time as we were talking about last week as the rest of aperitif culture, all the other things that led to aperitif culture. Concentration of wealth in cities, the emergence of a modern wine trade, marketing, branding, popular media, fizzy water, so you could have longer drinks where you could drink at leisure time. And then quinine had all these new effects that we can't talk about. You can Google them, that wormwood and gentian and other things that people knew didn't have. And so the rise of quinine, especially in France, essentially looks like the rise of CBD today. I hope there aren't too many fervent CBD followers out there, but essentially everybody wanted it and they weren't sure why.
And they were putting it in everything, right?
They were putting it in everything, including Grove's tasteless chill tonic. Tasteless because people didn't like the flavor of quinine. It tasted like medicine. I mean, it's bitter. Mm-hmm. And it makes children and adults as fat as pigs. I figured that's not actually making a health claim. But,
it's a wonder we don't use horrible baby pig marketing anymore. I don't know why this didn't catch on.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in Earth 2. So, but really, quinine and quinquina and quinato are the upstarts here, but they were the ones that the quinine really captured the wonder of late 19th century and early 20th century Europe in a lot of ways that wormwood and gentian did not. The when, like I was just saying, mid-late 1800s, the heyday of aperitif drinking and the spritz. Remember, the spritz is any fizzy drink. And the height of the rise of fizzy water in the late 19th century really created this leisure culture. Gentian, there are non-wine-based gentian things, of course, out there, not just from Italy. Salers, which is a gentian liqueur from the Auvergne, a mountainous region in the center of France, something we also represent, is available at Binny's and is something, if you want to really get into the core of gentian by itself, that's a great product. There's a redistillation of gentian there, which brings a lot of perfume and that white pepper note, as well as an infusion of gentian. But we're going to stick to wine tonight. Like I said, quinine was the hot new thing. And here's another great ad. Beer Quinquina especially has a lot of wonderful old ads from this time. Popular media, popular marketing and branding. Wines weren't branded in the late 19th century and early 20th century, except for maybe a few producers in Bordeaux. So if you were a marketing person and you wanted to market in drinks, you did an aromatized wine. The category was in the name, and people bought aromatized wines because they wanted that botanical, and then you used your marketing and hopefully your skill at compounding to make it taste good too. Where and who? Americano was primarily made by wine and vermouth producers in Piemonte. There's not a lot of new ground to plow there. Quinato, the Italian version of quinine bittered wine, often made by wineries to use up excess wines. Quinquina, though, very much much more surfed this world of popular marketing and branding, and so producers in sort of rural parts of France or lesser known parts of France used quinquina to advertise their region. So there's two great ads here that kind of illustrate that. Bonal, the flavor of the Alps, right? Bonal has gentian and quinine in it. And gentian is a mountain plant. So everybody wanted quinine, but the folks who made Bonal were like, well, we'll put some gentian in it too to remark about our place. Mate from Corsica, they use Corsican grapes, which are very perfumey and high acid. Corsican citrus, which was even then renowned as the best in France, to create an identity for Corsica through quinquina. Now, Corsica was particularly important. I mean, most French folks only knew Corsica as the home of Napoleon, and that wasn't a great thing in Third Republic France. So, Mate was a big part of Corsica advertising itself, not just as a vacation spot, but also as a spot to do business for these nouveau riches. Why Americano and Quinquina? Again, two more bitter botanicals that people wanted for reasons that we can't talk about without running afoul of the law. Quinine was the miracle drug. Bonal, L'Ami des Sportifs, Bonal was a sponsor of the Tour de France and often used imagery of mountaineering or athleticism to advertise itself. And then, like we talked about last week, the rise of the demand for these botanicals came at a point when distilled alcohol was still expensive. And so wine was cheap and available, and often could bring some flavor to the party. And so producers would use wine, a little bit of alcohol, to extract the botanicals. But using that wine and then also wanting to show a regional style led to products that differentiated themselves in a way that could be associated with a region.
Now, Jake, 2 weeks in a row now, you've mentioned that distilled spirits were more expensive then. Is this a function of the column still hadn't essentially taken over yet, and these are batch distilled spirits, so they were just by nature smaller production, more expensive?
Certainly there were column stills around, but they were in big cities, and the big problem was transportation. You know,
and how much? That would be the question. How much distillation outside of brandy distillation, or for a second purpose, how much distillation was even done anywhere for just bulk alcohol?
Right, it wasn't not until you fight a war.
Yeah.
It takes a war to make alcohol cheap. And that's what happened here as well.
Yep.
All right, and then of course the most important question is how to use these things in drinks. We'll talk through a bunch of different products tonight and some particular insights, but you're going to hear some things over and over again. One is this term spritz. Remember, the word spritz does not refer to one drink marketed by a large multinational company trying to sell red bitter. It refers to any fizzy drink, and classically refers to any fizzy drink with a wine-based substrate, which actually tosses out that large multinational red bitter. But we'll let them in. Fizzy things were drinks of leisure. Americano, being Italian, tends to be on the sweet side. That's why we're going to actually talk about them after Quinquina here tonight. The core of Americano making was in Piemonte with aromatic grapes. So you have something that's quite sweet, quite aromatic. So you want to add a base note to it in a drink, and a good, properly junipery gin can often work very nicely for that. But also earthy, clear spirits, whether that's certain types of pisco, but of course my personal favorite, which is agave spirits, work so well to kind of play up the overall aromatic nature of these things. Quinquina has a really great diversity. There are Quinquinas where the flavor is very much driven by the grapes. We'll talk about 2 of those tonight. And there you have, often the grapes were not fermented. They were just whacked with alcohol right away, a mixture known as mistel. And so they add a lot of texture to cocktails, but they don't necessarily add a lot of nose. So you can use very showy aromatic spirits, whether those might be modern gins that are very floral, or again, agave spirits, to kind of mesh with the richness on the palate of those fresh grapes. Other quinquinas were more driven by botanicals and were meant to be a much more bitter sort of experience for the drinker. And I find that a lot of those quinquinas actually work better with a lot of wooded spirits often than vermouth does. Simply the way things play off each other on the palate is something we might talk a little bit about next week. Barolo Quinato, the classic Italian quinine bittered wine, is kind of off in its own little world. There's no tradition of mixing with it. It is the classic sort of celebratory Italian digestif. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. There's some very important food pairings. Of course, being bittersweet, these things tend to go very nicely with foods that are salty or high fat or high protein cut through them. And we'll talk about a few of those as well. So that's kind of the theory, if you will, the 202. We'll talk about a few examples. I don't know if you want to stop for questions or anything right now, Pat, Brett, Dan.
Well, I mean, everybody, if you have questions, just use the Q&A, and we will, of course, answer them all as best we can. But I say let's dive into this here. So, I mean, the big thing, Jake, if somebody's at home tasting some of these along with us, what is is there a trademark they should look for gentian versus cinchona bitterness?
Sure. So go quickly back to the beginning here. Gentian is going to feel very normal to you if you drink other bitter things. It's earthy. It's sort of like if you looked up bitter in the dictionary, it would describe the flavor of gentian. I find that it stimulates the middle of my tongue. It's, like I said, earthy, but also just sort of background bitter. Like if you,
Earthy is always the description that comes to mind when I think of gentian.
It's interesting, and people don't think about it when you said like the core of a lettuce. That's actually good because you don't think of much in terms of flavor with a head of lettuce. Yeah. But the core of the lettuce is that it's almost like an umami type sensation of earthiness rather than an overt forward flavor.
Yeah. And a lot of bitterness is tactile. A lot of bitterness is about stimulation more than flavor. Just like, bitterness was meant to engender a fight or flight response, right? And so if your tongue feels overstimulated or cinched up, it's going to create that fight or flight response, or salivation and stomach juice production as we look at it. Cinchona is a little bit harder to describe without using words like flat, which you're not supposed to do when you market beverage alcohol. So I always think of the flavor of quinine as all the way almost off the back of your tongue and barky, very, very dry spice. Like think of cinnamon, but drier. But you'll always feel it in the same spot. If you take a very dry tonic water like Phenomens and you taste it, you'll always feel this dryness all the way in the back of your tongue. And that is the easiest way to sense quinine in something. All right. So we're going to start with two quinquinas that I find to be very much grape driven. And the first is from the southwest of France. Beer, it's pronounced, not burr. Beer is from what we call today the Roussillon, which is the little sliver of Catalonia that's also in France. It's one of the warmest wine-producing regions in France, and one of the things that Beer Quinquina was always an expression of was those hot red grape vineyards. Carignan and Grenache is the base now. There's that word mistel again. Mistel is, and this is often where we talk about grape-driven things, mistel is unfermented grape juice that's hit with alcohol right away. It's regulated like wine as long as the overall mixture at the end is at least 75% grape must.
Unfermented fruit juice, right? Because you can have other mistels, but
yeah, but
because what was Dan? You had a mistel for. You had a mistel that we were using in September.
Yeah, but you have a mistel too that made of apple. It's a general term for fruit juice. And the mistel made of apple is called pommeau, but it's more commonly thought of in terms of grapes, and certainly all these are with grape. But it's a general.
And this usually the alcohol that you said it gets fortified with is almost always going to be brandy then, like a neutral brandy.
This is neutral alcohol.
No? Okay.
This is neutral alcohol. Yeah. I don't ever want to use, even if something is distilled with grapes, I don't want to call it brandy unless it's flavorful.
Okay.
But these are going to be neutral. Certainly in the modern day, it's neutral because that's predictable. I love pommeau and flock and things like that. But if you're making a botanical thing, you got to be really good to get it consistent if you're using non-neutral alcohol as your fortifier. So. These are commercial products. It's one thing if you're only making 600 bottles a year and it was $75 on the shelf at Binny's, but one of the ways that these things can get to you at a reasonable price is using neutral alcohol to fortify and getting very good consistent product from the use of grapes and botanicals. So Carignan and Grenache unfermented, you might suspect this is quite fruity and red fruited and driven by the flavor of the grapes, and you'd be right. You might think of beer as refreshing port. It's on the sweet side. It's not particularly bitter. There's a little bit of an elderflower note that kind of supports the grapes and sets the quinine in relief.
Refreshing port, huh?
Yeah.
I do find it particularly grapey of like all these things that we taste. This is the one where I think it really shows its base.
Indeed.
Well, where would this is interesting because one that is very, very broadly, I think, in this family would be the original Lillet. And which came
Lillet
first? The Quina Lillet, right?
Yeah.
So which one was that? Just a regional version of this, or this was a regional version of?
I mean, Quinquina is Quinquina. So Lillet comes from Bordeaux.
Okay.
And Lillet Blanc was mainly based in Semillon, I believe Semillon, and a grape called Muscadel, which is not a Muscat. And was meant to reflect that area. Of course, Lillet, Bordeaux, the land of bankers, plenty of bankrolling for marketing, and so Lillet became very prominent.
Right.
You know, there's so much can be explained about the histories of different quinquinas simply by understanding where they're from. In the case of beer, if you go today to the Roussillon, there's a lot of wonderful grower producers of wine. But if you look at their old buildings, almost all of them have beer painted on them, or maybe scratched out or painted over, because almost all of their daddies and granddads sold their grapes to make beer. Beer saved the vignoble of the Roussillon. And it's only in the last 20 years or so that small grower producers have become the what we see from the Roussillon here in the States. Because beer is so fruity, this is what I like to bring to Christmas parties. I realize Christmas parties aren't really a thing this year, but maybe 1 or 2 person Christmas parties, because it's just great on the rocks with the lemon peel. They like to drink it with tonic there. That's a relatively sweet drink, but something that is quite stimulating. I love to mix beer with agave spirits, and this is, again, these grape-driven quinquinas, this one and then one after it, they work great with really aromatic spirits because you'll smell mostly the spirit in the finished cocktail, and then you'll get the texture of the grapes when you taste it. For me, I really love reverse drinks. I really love instead of taking 2 ounces of a sort of meh spirit, I'd rather take a half an ounce of a spirit I really love that I keep around anyway and put it in the drink. You get all the notes, you get enough of the flavor, and then you don't have to buy something that's just kind of meh. And beer is perfect for that. You can take a big glass of beer and just put a little drizzle of a good mezcal or a good Blanco tequila. It's going to show through beautifully.
I can attest to that.
Yeah.
Someone dropped off a beautiful bottle of mezcal at my house a few months ago, and I was tasting last week actually with another fellow on the phone here today, and who suggested that, and it was absolutely delicious. Beautiful mezcal, a little bit of beautiful mezcal went a long way, and you have this sort of rich, bitter, beautiful wine-bodied cocktail, which was perfect.
And smoke, and I think that smoke plays, especially the tiny bit of smoke that's going to be in the mezcal. Because if I think that I know the one that you're talking about, it's not super. Yeah, I would know it's not super. There, smoke is an enhancer, not a prominent characteristic of it. But that's certainly, and it kind of hits the same place anyway, on the back of the mouth. Did you have any fruit clothespin to your glass?
No, not clothespin. Although I've got a drawer full of clothespins. What a perfect.
You got to step that cocktail garnish game up, Farber.
Folks, my screen has gone blank. I can still hear you. I think you guys can see me. I'm going to do my usual thing that usually works, but we'll see. If it doesn't work, I'll get you back in a second.
All right.
But, Roussillon is also the windiest appellation I can think of in France. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous appellation. And, it does have some spectacular fruit, but man, is it incessantly windy.
Do you know what the wind is called?
What?
You know what the name of the wind is? It's not Mariah.
No, and it's not Mistral. No, I don't.
It's called the Tramontane. Tramontane, which is a portmanteau of trans and montagne, mountain. Basically, so strong it's said to be able to go through the mountains.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Now, getting back to the refreshing port bit, this stuff is great with every blue cheese I can think of. We often talk about how, and we sell a lot of interesting fortified unaromatized wines, which we may talk about at a later date. But we often talk about how certain foods need botanicals to really be refreshed off your palate. And I find a lot of blue cheeses work best with beer quinquina rather than a Banyuls or a Sauternes or something like that. All right. Moving along to another grape-driven quinquina. This is the first of two quinquinas we'll talk about from Corsica. Corsica is the island just directly south of, in the Mediterranean of mainland France. And the Cap Corse is the little middle finger it raises to the rest of France. It's a little finger of land jutting out the top of Corsica. And Louis Napoleon Maté, as a way of marketing Corsica to France, started making quinquina on the island in the late 1800s using Corsican grapes and Corsican citrus. And so today there are two quinquinas that we work with from them. Both work off the same base, which is Vermentino and Muscat, the two most important white grapes on the island. Vermentino brings a ton of acidity off of volcanic soils, and Muscat brings a nice richness and a little bit of sweet citrus. Here, one of the things that they do at Maté that's really important is they'll make a mistel from these grapes, but unlike at Beer or Bonal, they won't add any more sugar over and above the mistel. So these are going to be, for a sweet aperitif wine, relatively dry. And with all the acidity you get from the Vermentino juice, and that's very primary acidity because there's no time for malolactic fermentation, these are pretty refreshing, bright quinquinas, the Blanc and the Rouge. The Blanc is the easy spritz. Cedrat, which is you might know also as etrog. It's a very thick-skinned, aromatic, kind of big, ugly lemon-looking thing. Provides a lot of perfume. Dan is looking for a nice picture of a Cedrat.
He is, yes.
This is another one. I mean, I look, I love agave spirits with a lot of these things because I love that kind of aromatic style of drink. But this is definitely one, if you have a more floral gin that you're playing around with. I don't know if you get Pat and Brett, you want to talk about some of your favorite floral gins that you sell. But this is one that's going to really provide a nice backbone to that. There's a Cedrat. Yeah. Look at that thick skin.
We just brought we just actually brought in a number of gins from Belgium, and there was one. It was Clover gin, and I don't remember. There was Lucky Number 4. They used lavender amongst other things. Was one of the forward, without being over the top. Because I think that if you don't apply floral character to anything correctly, it can be overwhelming really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, my view on gin is there are gins for classic gin cocktails and there's gins for tonic and quinquina.
Well, and there's
two almost mutually exclusive sets. And
we've got
modern gins are fun, but decide what you're going to use for your martini and your French 75, and then take some of these modern gins and drink them more simply or for drinks that are particularly.
And another, it's the effect I think is more subtle, but we also have a number of gins coming out. You're seeing more where they're using tea of some form. Probably the biggest commercial one is Drumshambo from Ireland, but the Kino B, some of the gins that are coming out of Kyoto,
or the Roku, the Suntory gin.
Right, and Roku is another one.
Beautiful gin with this quinquina.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a very floral modern gin that isn't over the top with the pininess. That would work really well here.
Yeah, one thing, both quinquinas and Americanos can work with those kind of floral gins. And basically, the way I think about it is, if the gin is also astringent, kind of really, really out there, then you need something sweeter than most quinquinas. So you might go for an Americano. Where if it's quite suave, like the Roku, then a quinquina is perfect. So this is something I really adore because I love the wines of Corsica, especially the wines of Patrimonio, which is where the Vermentino comes from. And I find this to be a wonderful pairing for sheep's milk cheeses, or I mean, you can even a light spritz of this could work with a really funky seafood pasta. But if you love Corsican wines, if you've never had this, you should really try it. If you've never had Corsican wines and you really like this, you should really drink some Corsican wines. There's some really beautiful stuff out there. Now, the other quinquina that Maté makes, I completely forgot to put the presentation. So let me pull it up on the website. This is what happens when year-end stuff crashes on you. So there we go, Cap Corse Maté Rouge. This is our website. So This is my way of showing off the website. So
It's a
from the
great
top,
website. Tons of great info on there.
from the top under wines, we have our oxidized wines, but then also our aromatized wines. So I went to the Quinquina page, and then all of our beautiful quinine bittered wines, and I went down and clicked on Mété Cap Corse Rouge. Information about the product, information about the producer, information about the category, some lovely pictures, and then recipes, cocktail recipes. There's some storage information here, cocktail recipes here, which you can then click on to get more right here. And that's part of our recipe database, which is, you can click on here, and this has got 498 recipes in it, and we're looking for more. So Mété Rouge is kind of the opposite of Mété Blanc in some ways, in that it's much more driven by the bitter botanicals. It's the same mistel as the base. The citrus element is bitter and sweet orange. But then in addition to more quinine, there's a fairly good whack of walnut husks in this. Walnut husks are, I like to say, cheap, available, and bitter. They taste exactly what you think they taste like, but their bitterness hits pretty close to where the quinine bitterness does. So this comes across as much more kind of stimulatingly bitter.
Jake, when you say husks, do you mean like as if
Skin.
in a nocino, like the outer fleshy husk, or the inner?
No,
oh, you're talking the inner nut. The inner
No. The only the outer part. So
Right.
nocino used the whole nut.
Yep.
It's the whole thing, including the outer part and the nut meat. But this is just the outer part.
Right.
Because
But
the nuts are processed for eating.
Because nocino is just the whole with the outer skin soaked, right?
Yeah.
So you're not, I guess there's some penetration, but you're still deriving most of the character out of that outer husk.
Well, you get texture from the nut meat.
Right.
You get fat, literally. So in this case, it's just the outer bit that is taken away when they process the walnuts for eating, because people eat walnuts in France. But that brings a nice sort of intense bitterness as well. So I find this to be something that works particularly well with wooded spirits. It certainly can work with bourbon or rye, although I find that drinks with bourbon or rye and Cap Corse Rouge need a little bit of extra sweetness involved because of the intensity of the tannins of the whiskey and the intensity of the walnut. But what I really love with Mété Rouge is Calvados. Just there's something about the perfume and the texture of Calvados that works so well with this kind of coming in behind it on the palate. Now, a characteristic of Mistel that we haven't talked about yet from a mixology perspective that's particularly interesting is something I like to call dilutability. Because the acid is so primary in that Mistel, it hasn't gotten softer through fermentation. Generally, the textures and flavors and acids of Mistels will hold up in a long drink. So one of my favorite drinks to make with Mété Rouge is to take half and half with Calvados and then lengthen that into a highball. And it's those kind of complex highballs that work really well before a meal, but kind of keep you in the mood for having a nice meal and drinking a nice bottle of wine. So I'll show you around the website more later, but apologize for not sticking that in, but give me a chance to show you the website. So, but again, a very stark contrast to the Blanc. The Blanc is pretty and bright. This is much more gutsy. It's sort of the old man drink on the island, if you will.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah. I know Dan's a big Mété Rouge fan.
Jake, would you pair that with brandies or cognacs too?
Yeah.
Or do you think that would be a little
too
perfumed?
In general, what I like to call them light brown spirits, which would be brown spirits that aren't bourbons or rye, things that are raised in used cooperage.
Mm-hmm.
Scotches.
Your Calvados selection must be getting beautiful now.
You guys want to talk about your Calvados selection?
It's tough right now with Calvados.
Yeah, I mean, it is there. The problem is a bunch of people were kind of sticking to the old reliables. There's unfortunately some of the great producers have had some issues in terms of our ability to get them. Mm-hmm. Like Roger Grolt, for instance, is kind of, they've gone through some, we can't get it. They've gone through some some changes in terms of import. So Clock Pepin has probably been one of the more interesting ones we brought in recently. A lot of the big volume ones that were driven through the Lecomte family also fell out. So
Mhm.
we're really selling a little bit of Grolt. We're selling a lot of Clock Pepin. Christian Drouin, I mean, there's been some upheaval in that category,
Mhm.
which is
I-
too bad because it's beautiful and underrated.
I can't say any more than this, but I hear from a little birdie that help is on the way. So
Okay.
watch this space, Chicago, Chicagoland. All right, and then the last of the quinquinas, Bonal, and this will be a nice segue into gentian stuff because Bonal, as we talked about earlier, is both gentian and quinine, the gentian being the local signature, if you will. This is, again, a bitter-driven quinquina. The grapes here are relatively neutral stuff, Uni Blanc and things like that. They bring texture, they bring acidity. Bonal is actually thought of as a category in the Alps, and different producers make their own and call it Bonal, but it is also a branded thing. And the farther you get from a big city, the less trademark laws really matter. This is another one I find works really well with kind of mountain cheeses, salty cheeses, pâtés and terrines. And again, those sort of gently wooded spirits, whether that's a scotch or a brandy of some sort, or a lower proof bourbon or rye.
Having just had fondue last night, I can say that if you were in the Alps or you were in the Savoie like this, you'd almost always be offered a Bonal after dinner. It's definitely the go-to digestif for a wintry.
And that goes to something we talked about last week as well, which is an aperitif and a digestif are the same thing. Very, very important. It's
which we talked about, right? Because they're both meant to stimulate.
Right, they're both stimulating. I have an old ashtray swag from Tapatio Tequila, and the little caption on it says "El aperitivo más fino," whereas we might think of tequila, a nice tequila, as a digestif here in America. One of the cool things that it sometimes get overlooked with Bonal is how good it is with cider. And by this, I mean either the cloudy apple juice you get in gallon jugs at the supermarket or the farmer's market, but also nice, dry, hard ciders. And that's a really fun, festive thing that's very easy to make. Just kind of glug in a glass with some ice. But there's just something about how Bonal picks up apples.
It's got so much woody spice to it that the kind of I think spice character you associate with, fall and those kind of apple ciders like that. I think that's really a perfect pairing. That's why I'm sipping on the Bonal right now, and it would just be wonderful with a nice cider.
Yeah, and Bonal has enough texture, and it's not so bitter that with the right amount of sweetening, you can make a very nice toddy with it, and maybe just a little bit of scotch, or a nice aged rum. So
I'm looking at the mountain cheeses, thinking of Tom or some Gruyere or Comté or Abondance
exactly right.
We're just storming directly back to the fondue.
Yeah,
I guess that's true.
Bitterness scrubs fats and proteins off the palate in a way wine only can dream of.
And that drink is definitely lacking a clothespin.
Yeah, I mean, it's just trying to show it's a cocktail things. Lots of cocktails on the website, like you just saw. All right, we'll move to Americano now, and our primary producer of Americano is Koki, which we know also for Vermouth de Torino and Vermouth Amaro and Barolo Quinato, which we'll talk about in a moment. Americano is a lot of their stock and trade because Koki is a sparkling wine producer as well, and they're, in addition to making dry sparkling wines, the two great sweet sparkling wines of Piedmont, Asti Spumante or Moscato d'Asti for Frizzante Moscato, and Bracchetto d'Acqui are made with very aromatic grape varieties. And Americano is another great way to show off those same grapes. And so Americano Bianco is Moscato, Americano Rosa is Bracchetto. Because the Italians love sweeter things, so Americani tend to be on the sweeter side, and Koki is very much plays into that. In addition to gentian, in the Americano Bianco, there's a little bit of quinine as well, kind of building up bitterness on the back of the tongue. Nice sweet citrus. This is a very classic spritz, just with fizzy water all over Piedmont. Because it's on the sweeter side and because it brings a lot of sort of showy, orangey flavor from the grapes, I think this is a really good bitter backbone for a shaken drink. It can take to citrus very, very well, whether that's lemon or grapefruit. A lot of folks will use this in place of Lillet in Corpse Survivors #2 because it does provide a little more backbone than what Lillet is like today. Lillet comes from a different different tradition, but it's the way folks are wired. But you could add this in a gin. You could put this in a gin sour or a tequila sour, and it's going to work really, really nicely.
Lillet is
and it's
flavorless compared to this if you're going to taste them side by side.
well, the original was obviously a lot more along this, and I think that a lot of people get confused sometimes, because I know that I was until the first time I learned about it, that the Americano is also, or I think a lot more people know Americano as a cocktail made with a very large red bitter.
Red bitter, red vermouth, or diluted espresso. It's all goes back to that idea of a little bit bitter, Americante, or unlike the diluted espresso drink, the term Americano here is not a joke on Americans. So, now there's a little breaking news here. You'll notice the little slim bottle. We do have half bottles available of Americano Bianco and Americano Rosa now. So that's very exciting. One of the things I really like to pair with Americano Bianco, especially as a spritz, is anything with a bit of acid. So maybe a ceviche or some anchovies in vinegar, or just pickles or olives. Just that little, the saltiness and the bitterness work well, and just that little bit of extra acid kind of buttresses the spritz really, really well.
I drink Americano Bianco all summer long, just mixed with a little bit of sparkling water and then some red bitter of choice, which is usually Cappelletti or even Aperol if it's, if I don't mind it being on a little bit on the sweeter side.
Yeah. And anything that's this perfumey and this sweet can always take a little bit of hard spirit added to it. Again, do not think your drinks with spirits have to have a bunch of the spirit in it. It's a lot more fun when you allow that to be an independent variable, if you will. Americano Rosa, very much the cousin of Americano Bianco. Here are some rose and ginger are added to buttress the Bricchetto. Bricchetto has this great kind of red berry floral character that makes it
classic
wonderful.
Bricchetto.
Yeah. Bricchetto, the fizzy off-dry Bricchetto is often served with sorbets. And actually, this is quite a fun one to stick a scoop of a fruit sorbet in. It pretty much works with any fruit. The rose and the ginger bring a little extra bitterness here. And so I like, when I make a spritz with this, I like to garnish it with a grapefruit peel. The grapefruit peel, when you smell grapefruit oil is quite bitter. And so the oil kind of goes up your nose, goes down onto your tongue, and starts to stimulate bitter receptors on your tongue. So when you drink the drink, you don't taste as much of the bitterness because you can only taste so much bitterness at one time. So I think a grapefruit peel works particularly well with Coqui Rosa spritzes, as well as with Mété Rouge. Kind of tamp down the bitterness and bring it back into balance with the rest of the wine. This is another one. This is another one for gentle whiskeys. Lower proof bourbons, especially. The ginger really comes out when you mix Coqui Rosa with a lower proof bourbon. It is Aquavit week. Unfortunately, no Aquavit
That's
week
a thing, huh?
going on this year because of COVID. But one of my favorite simple, non-obvious cocktails is equal parts Aquavit and Coqui Rosa with a couple of dashes of Peychaud's just to kind of make it pinker.
That sounds gross.
It's delicious.
Which Aquavit do you use?
Well, so I sometimes refer to that drink as the fundamental theorem of Aquavit because I've tried it with about 20 different ones and they all seem to work.
Wow. I mean, Aquavit is obviously wildly variable. I mean, some are just pure dill, some are pure caraway. Those two things don't taste similar.
No, but they hit similar parts of the tongue.
Interesting.
And we actually have a number of Aquavits here because there are a bunch of distilleries in the upper Midwest with Scandinavian traditions that produce
Right.
them, as well as what we have from Europe. What we're missing this year, unfortunately, with the Blackhawks not in town, this is typically the time of the year when all of our friends, mostly Swedish defensemen with the Blackhawks, come to the stores and buy tons and tons and tons of aquavit from
Yeah.
us. Yeah.
Yeah.
At
Brett,
the
would you
risk
say
of
our Akavit selection is larger than our Calvados selection currently?
I would say it is
Some
very
stores
much
it's
larger.
close.
yeah, it's right there.
Well, yeah, you've got just with, I mean, in a lot of stores, just with the Alborg, the two Alborgs, the Line, you know, we've got the Gamalud in most of the stores. We've got Norden in a number of stores now. We've got the
Hovding.
Norden's quite good.
Yeah, Norden,
That's
they
from
did a very nice job with that.
That's some
Michigan.
Detroit area bartenders came up with that one. And
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
It's Akavit is definitely becoming a craft distiller's, darling now at this point.
Yeah.
We started pitching it with gin. Actually, we started, if we got people or if we have people who are interested in gin, they've been very well pleased to be introduced to Akavit, just as a little bit sort of.
I mean, we could do a
alternative.
whole session on what juniper tastes like when you distill it, but a lot of modern gins don't really have that dark, oily middle back of the tongue sensation of juniper anyway. So, I mean, Aquavit's just different botanicals, but similar sort of sensation. The one I miss from the old country is there's a Madeira cask finished Olborg that is really, really beautiful with all those old Danish, smørrebrød foods. That's really, really tasty.
Oily fishes.
Oily fishes, rye bread, too much butter. Yeah. Too much really good Danish butter. One of the more peculiar but magical food pairings I've ever had with a bittersweet wine is Cocchi Rosa and Parmigiano Reggiano. Definitely one to take a look at. I realize that Reggiano is under tariff right now, but you don't have to eat very much at one time. Cocchi actually do events with the Parmigiano Reggiano Consorzio, pairing a lot of different Cocchi aromatized wines with Reggiano. But for me, the Rosa is the big winner. All right. And we've talked a lot about cocktails. We've talked a lot about aperitif culture. We talked a lot about spritzing things. And now let's talk about the king of wines and the wine of kings. Barolo Quinato is exactly what it says on the label. Barolo, there's Barolo, is the most famous appellation for a grape called Nebbiolo, which is a high perfume but high tannin red grape. Imagine Pinot Noir's scruffy but very eminent grandfather. And the thing is, though, is back in the day, maybe 3 out of every 10 years would be really good for Barolo wine. And the rest of the years would be okay, but not great. Quinine was certainly a thing. And houses, producers wanted to have kind of something that they could make in their own style to keep their names out there, but also just something to have for the house. And so it became natural to take Barolo and quinine and sugar and other spices and bitter notes, depending on each producer's preference, and make a digestif, where the wine is a huge part of it, but also the particular botanical mix. 2 producers are really associated with the dawn of this category. One is Teobaldo Capellano in Gabuti, whose Barolo Quinato, which is still available today, is very much on the bitter medicinal side. It's amazing, but it is very firm. And then Giulio Cocchi, whose Quinato is much more on the sweet spice, round, rich side. There's a fair amount of cardamom and ginger in this. A little bit of rhubarb root adds some smokiness as well. But the thread that runs through Barolo Quinato is how it is one of the very few things in the world that actually works with dark chocolate. It's got enough different bitter notes to really scrub all the fats and proteins of dark chocolate off the palate and leave you refreshed. And then enough backbone to provide room for aromatic spices that might mesh particularly well with a given dark chocolate that you're eating.
I don't know of anyone who's tasted Barolo Quinato who hasn't fallen in love with it. Really, I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of those things where if you haven't tried it, you should, because you're going to love it. Really.
Yeah. And it is something you can celebrate with. It's also something you can cerebrate with, if you will. There's no tradition of mixing it. The one traditional sort of party way to drink it is to heat it up. In fact, if you go to the Bar Koki right in the center of Asti, you can get hot Barolo Quinato in a little Irish coffee mug, glass Irish coffee mug with a slice of orange. And it is very, very delicious. And it is for that reason that we actually, that Koki bottle Barolo Quinato in liter bottles, which we bring in for restaurants. But the common, what we see in shops are the half liters, which come, it's a tall, thin bottle, and it comes in kind of a Toblerone shaped box to remind you of chocolate. That said, if you've bought a nice single cask bourbon or rye from Brett and Pat's selections, this is certainly a great way to celebrate it in a little Manhattan type drink. If you've got it open already to have with chocolate, it does bring a ton of richness to the party. And again, with the quinine, kind of a different bitter than the wormwood, it'll flesh out the wood notes of a whiskey in a very different way than a wormwood does, or a vermouth does. So a little bit to recap, we've been through a lot. This is a little teaser for what's next. Pat and I have kicked around the idea of something that I call tongue mapping, to talk about how you play around with different botanical things in cocktails, and kind of a more enlightened version of the Mr. Potato Head theory of taking one cocktail and turning it into another. And so this frog with the very long tongue is a little teaser for that.
Yeah, how can we use what we've learned about botanicals, where those flavors are landing across your palate to build a better cocktail, to help you build a better cocktail? Should be pretty interesting. Jenny did ask if the products need refrigeration after opening. All of them do. Absolutely, all of them do.
Yes.
These are wine, and they need to be treated like wine. So you open them.
They need to be treated sort of like, actually, I guess that's the way I treat them, is like wine, which is why I rarely ever need to refrigerate them.
If you just take bottles to the face, like, damn.
Yeah. No, these tend to be on the sweeter side, so they often will go for 3 or 4 weeks. Basically, the sweeter something is, as long as you always keep it refrigerated, the thicker the liquid is, which means the less volatility of the pretty high aromatics there are in the liquid while it sits in the bottle.
Yeah, whereas like cousins of this, some Amari that are going to be higher in alcohol and spirit based are going to hold up better. They can,
and
last.
Even low alcohol spirit based things, refrigeration doesn't really do that much for them. I mean,
yeah. Well, and the other thing, just on the side of that, that's why a lot of these things for people that are, we're kind of talking about these in the context. Well, we're talking about them a lot with drinks, but also talking about them in the context of actually drinking them. We do, a number of these products have half bottles, all of which we carry, to make it so that way you're not, you're not tackling quite as much, especially if you're just using a little bit in a modifier. I mean, the Bear, a number of them, we have half bottles, so you can enjoy these quickly, or enjoy the bottle quickly without worrying about it going anywhere.
Yeah.
Mike asks,
Mike want to know. Oh, you saw it, Jake.
Yeah. Mike asks about the gas sprays. They work a little, but you still got to put them in the fridge.
Mm-hmm.
They work better against oxidation than they do against loss of aromatics, because you're still equilibrating with the gas in the bottle, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
and
exactly
so what
right.
we're talking about in a big part, so those that were, because Jake has emphasized this over the last 2 sessions a lot, that's the biggest thing. It's less, and we kind of talk about that when we talk about how quickly you need to consume a bottle of spirits and spin open. It is about the vibrancy of flavor. It's losing all the bright notes first. It's less of a worry about something, it's somehow spoiling or becoming bad for
the
you,
more volatile
as much as
compounds are
losing all its losing all the vibrance you don't want to, all the high tones, all the subtlety are the things that go away.
Chris asked that with a nod to Chicago, what is it that makes Malort so bitter? That is wormwood. And that's what we talked about last week that makes Vermouth bitter. Malort just uses a lot of wormwood.
Yeah. I mean, Malort is essentially grain alcohol and wormwood, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's wormwood and nothing else. So there's not a lot of layers to that. It is what it is.
Indeed.
It is the great American bitter. Come on, guys.
Oh, you don't gotta talk us into us. We're big fans. So we actually have they have the Carl Jepson company, the CH Distillery now bottles some bourbons that they source from MGP down in Indiana and some other distilleries in Tennessee and stuff. And we actually picked a bunch of single barrels this year, and we have Malort aging in our hand-picked barrels now that hopefully sometime in the spring here we'll be able to have a barrel-aged Malort tasting on Facebook.
We'll probably I think we're gonna hold them until next fall.
They're gonna be pretty aged by then. That'll be interesting to taste. All right, so watch this space. Next Monday, Brett and I are gonna be on with Charles Jolie doing some other cocktail stuff. Maybe we'll do this Tuesday, or maybe we'll take a week off and do it that week after Christmas then. But yeah, we'll be back with this tongue mapping concept. I know it kind of sounds goofy at face value, but it is fascinating.
Goofy. It's goofy, but Pat finds it fascinating.
It is fascinating. I as a guy who has never extended a lot of effort personally into making cocktails, I find it very helpful, and I think it's a fun thing to get you a little more interested in creating something that's not just one of the 4 cocktails that everybody makes at home, and that's it. Especially at a time when we can't go to some of these great, eateries and drinkeries that are known for really creative, interesting cocktails. This is a way to kind of help you at least get into that kind of mode of thinking at home, on how to build something a little more complex.
Yeah, and understand why you like things possibly.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
So it's a lot of fun. I mean, I've had Jake present it to some of the Binny staff before and talk about it in the context of these things before. So it's a lot of fun. When
we're drinking at home, right? Cocktails are great, but cocktails are more fun when it's a glug and a glug and a glass, right? And so if you have an idea of what each is bringing to the party, and tongue mapping is one way of thinking about that, then it'll be a lot easier to make those kind of drinks. What we'll also take a look at next time we get together is some other things from our portfolio whose flavors are built around one botanical. And that's something, we love all these wonderful Italian Amari with 57 ingredients in them, and they're wonderful to sip. But sometimes if you're going to make a cocktail, having something that's very focused can make it easier to build other things around it. And so we'll talk about those things, and that'll give Dan a chance to talk about all his favorite botanicals, or at least about rhubarb root and Sirbensaffen.
And a couple of
All right, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for joining us again. Thanks for all the awesome questions as usual. Keep an eye on binnies.com/virtual-events, I think it is, and we'll be back soon with more cocktail madness. Botanical bonanzas. All right, thanks, Jake. Thanks, Dan.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brad. We'll see you guys later.
Guys.
Cheers.
See ya. Cheers.